video series is meant as a thank you to all the U.S. taxpayers out there. We just want to say thanks for funding our wild European adventures. We couldn't have done it without your support. My portion of our epic Nurburgring saga begins in Italy on pre-deployment block leave. I got to drive a couple of Italian supercars on roads and racetracks there. The Gallardo 570-4 was the best sounding but had the worst gearbox. It's like they recorded someone driving a stick for the first time and then turned it into a shift algorithm. The 458 Spider is an amazing engineering accomplishment that something that can be that fast, that refined, that well-rounded just blows my mind. But for me, it wasn't the best one. For me, the best was the 430 Scuderia. Driving the 430 Scuderia was a life-changing experience. The combination of a 9,000 RPM engine, short gearing, super lightweight, neck-breaking grip, and that stunningly violent, quick, single-clutch gearbox converted me from a drag strip car guy into a road course car guy in one drive. I discovered that a car could be exciting and engaging far beyond the numbers that it could post at a drag strip. When I got home, I sold my supercharger and nitrous kit, and over deployment, I ordered some springs and shocks and sway bars. My Firebird formula was in pretty sad shape after 10 years and 100,000 miles as a daily driver. Now, the worst thing that I did to the car in that period of time was what any car guy would do upon arrival to Germany with an American muscle car. I went straight to the Autobahn at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I had to see how fast the car would go. Now, the answer for a 98 Firebird formula with an intake and long tubes is a stunning 173 miles an hour, with probably a slight tailwind. Now, the downside to doing this is that it took nearly 2 minutes at close to redline in 5th gear to achieve that speed number. After the run, I noticed the oil pressure was very low, much lower than normal, so I took the car home and changed the oil. It came out looking like burnt metal flake paint. An unbelievable amount of metal came out of the engine, and the oil pressure was never the same afterward. Now, for the suspension, it was in terrible shape. The front suspension, anytime you went over rumble strips, would go into full-on thumper mode. The rear suspension, anytime you encountered a bump, would do an excellent impression of a perpetual motion machine, the shocks doing absolutely nothing to dampen out motion. So like most gearheads, I'm a fan of Top Gear, and I'd seen their 10-minute challenge at the Nurburgring. The trip to the Nurburgring from where we were stationed was absolutely amazing. About half to maybe 2/3 of the way was de-restricted Autobahn, and so if you didn't run into a stau, it was almost as much fun as running the ring itself, especially when you're in a pack of 6 or 7 American muscle cars. There's the limiter. Damn it. That's all the faster she'll go in 5th or 6th. When I got to the ring, my overriding impression was that I had never felt so at home in a new place. The people, the scenery, even the damp weather just felt like home. My first time lap around the ring was a 12:30. I'm sure that there are worse cars to learn the Nurburgring in than a 400 horsepower pony car on snow tires, although I can't think of any. I was so focused on not dying, I wasn't learning the track. So instead, I rented a 195 horsepower Renault Clio with sticky tires, big brakes, and an excellent driving position. My 6th lap in that car was a 10 flat and 56/10. Not under 10, but close enough for me for my first trip. I jumped back into the formula, and even with my new knowledge of the track, the best I could do was a 10.03. The tires were getting so hot that the rubber was sloughing off in handfuls. The oil was getting so hot that I was starting to lose oil pressure. The power steering fluid was boiling over and spraying all over the engine compartment, and the brake pedal was very inconsistent. As I'm standing there trying to wrap my head around how 200 more horsepower would make a car 3 seconds slower, a tall German gentleman stops me and asks me if I'd like to do a formation lap with another F-body. I tell him what bad shape my car is in, and that I still have a 4-hour trek home. So instead, he offers me a ride in his '99 Z28 Camaro, German spec of course. Engine-wise, it's completely stock. It has the same suspension setup as my car, but with cooled 13-inch brakes and 275 summer-only tires. He takes me for a ride somewhere in the low 9s. He said his best was in the 830 to 845 range. I learned more from that one lap than all my previous laps put together. First and foremost, I learned, like most drag racers turned road racer, it's more important to maximize the corner speed, especially corner exit speed, than to always be in the lowest possible gear. In drag racing, you drive the motor, always trying to extract every last horsepower from the engine. If you apply that theory to a road course, you just cook everything, as I did. Of course, I felt like a fool, having been unable to get under 10 minutes in a car with 50 more horsepower and 400 pounds less weight. My next trip to the track was a track day as opposed to a tourist day like we usually did. Now, what that means is, on a track day, you can lap and lap to your heart's content. On a tourist day, every time you pass the gates on the front straight, you've got to swipe your card and pay for an additional lap. For this trip, I rented an MX-5 Miata because even when you're 6'4", the answer is always Miata. The car had a cage, R888 tires, racing brakes, coilovers, and a stripped interior. The cage was a bit of a problem. The cage bar contacted the left side of my helmet and forced me to drive with my head tilted off to the right. On the plus side, I didn't have to support my head in right-hand turns. I managed a 921 on my very first outlap. As I burned off fuel, I managed to get down to an 856.48. Shortly after that, my fuel light came on. So I pulled off and refueled, and having broken the 9-minute barrier, my courage got the best of me. I turned off traction control and went for broke. It may have been the extra 70 liters of fuel, the lack of electronic assistance, or more likely, the dehydration and exhaustion from 13 consecutive laps of the Nurburgring, but I couldn't get back below 9 minutes to save my life. A 906 was the best I could do. The coolest discovery I made by turning off the nannies is that the car had been flying on me. I didn't realize it because as the car went airborne with the systems on, it held the motor back. But after I turned the systems off, the engine was free to bounce off the rev limiter, and as I landed, the tires actually gave a nice little squeal and a little puff of smoke. Quite cool, if a bit unnerving the first time it happened.
Oh yeah, got there.
Some weeks later, I finished breaking in my 2012 Mustang GT. Stock, these things have got the body control of your grandma's 20-year-old Buick with blown shocks, and the brakes are even worse. With 420 horsepower, they're a bit sketchy on track days. The suspension is really set up for drag racing on these cars, especially the base model. The rear sway bar is way too soft, and so the rear end has significantly more grip than the front end. What that creates is a car that always wants to push, so it has a tendency to overheat and eat up the front tires. Now, when you do get it loose, and you can because of the 420 horsepower, it's absolutely terrifying the way that the car transitions back and forth from understeer to oversteer and back again. I arrived late on a weekday. It's raining, so I decided to do some sighting laps and get a feel for the track. The GT pushes viciously in the rain and then transitions to snap oversteer and then back to pushing. Combine that with a traction control that feels like it's asleep, and it was absolutely bowel loosening. And then it started to snow on me. At this point, I was feeling lucky just to have gotten the car back in one piece. So I decided to take some Brits up on their offer of steak and beer. I spent the evening getting drunk on German beer and trying in vain to convince 3 British college kids that not only was there still a war in Afghanistan that I would be headed to in less than 2 weeks, but their own country was still involved. The next morning, the weather is still crappy, and while out running a 1044 on a damp track, I get passed by an Aston Martin race car that sells lap rides. I thought, hey, what a great way to learn the track and not die. So I go back to the paddock, I buy my ticket, and I wait. About 45 minutes goes by, and the Aston Martin comes back on a wrecker. The gearbox had blown up. So I swapped my ticket for a ride in the M5 taxi. My driver has raced BMWs for 18 years and had been a factory development test driver for 10. As we're pulling out onto the track, the other M5 ring taxi slips out in front of us. A few times in life have I encountered better timing. The first M5 gets probably 30 car lengths on us as we're creeping up to the gate. The racing brake pads letting out an ear-splitting squeal, as they do when asked to work cold. As we wait for the arm to swing up, my driver tells me, "You're gonna get scared. When you feel uncomfortable, tell me and I slow down." So I tell him, "I'm a week away from going to Afghanistan. I just want you to catch the other M5 taxi." The arm comes up and we creep onto the course through the cones that form a mini chicane. He nods with a simple okay and a psychotic smile. As we clear the chicane, he turns off the traction control and goes flat to the floor. Now, I know the M5s have got that synthetic noise, but man does it sound good, like a combination of the old 4-liter V8 out of the M3 and a jet engine. As we rocket towards the first series of corners, we pass my normal braking point, still at full tilt. When he finally does apply the brakes, it's with a butter-smooth brutality that I never thought possible, and will forevermore be my target when it comes to threshold braking. I can feel the monstrous sedan shifting around underneath me in a 4-wheel skid. The nose pitches directly at the steel arm co, and I suddenly realize the error of offering such a challenge to a competitive Type A personality behind the wheel of a prepared M5, and I accept my inevitable fiery death. The 4-wheel drift carries us clear of the arm co, but I swear we're so close that I feel it brush my arm hair through the door. After the ride, I look just to be sure we didn't trade any paint. At Flugplatz, it's like a replay from the movie Free Willy. All 4,800 pounds of M5 and passengers become airborne, and I find the M5's weak point: lack of headroom. My helmetless head smashes into the padded roof of the M5. It feels like we landed full power, but I'm not sure. All I was seeing was stars. We catch sight of the other M5 just after mid-track. The sight of our M5 gives the one in front a bit of the red mist, and he starts pushing harder. During an uphill right-hand corner, I can see daylight between his inside front tire and the asphalt. At the same time, the rear end is squirming and laying down intermittent black streaks as it tries to apply all 556 horsepower. We stay on the bumper of the other M5, with our driver calmly talking me through the course and mistakes people commonly make. The experience of watching two professional race car drivers battle it out around the ring in identical M5s was beyond words. They say your life flashes before your eyes when you die. I hope that when I die, this one makes the highlight reel. The course is now dry and my confidence is up, so I go out for a fast lap in my GT. It still pushes, but now that the track is dry, the rear end is glued. By the last series of corners, the brake pedals go into the floor, and the brakes are smoking, but I managed to cross the line at an 8:59, just under 9 minutes. Not bad for a bone stock car so unsuited to track work. I've experienced brake fade before, but even after letting the brakes cool down, the pedal never comes back. The car just doesn't want to stop. So I take the car home, and on post-track inspection, I discover that the brake pads have actually disintegrated on me this time. To the engineers at Ford, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys building and selling a 150-mile-an-hour capable, 420 horsepower American muscle car for only $25,000, and then shipping it to Germany at taxpayer expense. But I think extra $200 for a decent set of brake pads would have been appropriate. This brings us to my last trip before my most recent deployment. I couldn't bring myself to go on deployment knowing that my stock Ford Mustang was faster than my Firebird formula that I'd put so much work into. So I made one last trip to the Nurburgring in the days before. Prior to it, I did one last round of mods as well. I got the highest temperature brake fluid I could get. I added Hawk DTC 70 brake pads to it. I sealed up the radiator, ripped out the air conditioning, and then I lowered the rev limit from 6,300 to 5,900 in the hopes that that would help keep the engine cool. I don't know how to explain the desperate feeling that permeates everything you do in the days and weeks before you deploy. There's this sense that you have to cram in everything that you want to do for the next year into those last few days or weeks. Now, combine that feeling with knowing that I wouldn't have another chance to prove the Firebird faster than my Mustang for at least a year, and then top it off with 2 cans of Red Bull. It took me to a pretty intense mental place. For my last lap, again, I try my best to save the tires at first. I managed to pass a poorly driven 2011 GT500 hard on the brakes into a corner, as if he was standing still. I brunch and the tail comes out wide under braking. I almost lose it, but managed to gather up a big slide right on the rumble strips. The tires are starting to get greasy. I realize I'm overdriving, so I ease up. I'm holding it all together until the mini carousel. I carry more speed into the mini carousel than I ever have before. The key with a live axle is to wait for smooth pavement to try and apply power. Just as I think I've made it, I get on the gas. but there's one last concrete seam. That last bump throws the rear end up in the air, my foot already flat to the floor. The engine bounces off the rev limiter, and then the rear tires land, no longer behind the fronts. I feel a moment of sheer horror as I stare at the Armco in front of me. Not because of my impending crash, but because I know that I've blown the fastest lap I've ever done and my last chance to prove the Firebird faster than the Mustang. I get into a massive tank slapper. I overcorrect probably 4 times before I skid off into the grass and narrowly miss the wall. Then, I miraculously skid back onto the track, still doing almost 40 miles an hour. I credit the snow tires and their ability to maintain traction even in the grass. I take it easy through the double right-handers that lead you back onto the main straight. Knowing that I've blown my last lap, I hit my watch anyways. To my shock, the time is an 8:56.24. Even with the big mistake, 4 seconds faster than the Mustang and 0.2 faster than the MX-5 race car that I'd rented. At that moment, I felt like it was the end of my Nurburgring story. After the suicidal chances I had taken on that last lap, a trip to the moon seemed a more realistic goal for my Firebird than trying to go under 8 minutes. That time stayed on my watch for a year. Before each lap of the ring, one of my rituals was clearing the last lap and resetting my watch to 0. In some way, it represented the pause in my life and gave me a symbolic moment to look forward to. Everyone deserves a best friend and an arch nemesis for each chapter of their life. For this next chapter, my buddy Adam was both for me. As we're getting ready to deploy, I meet Adam. He's even more obsessed with the Nurburgring than I am, but he's a die-hard Ford guy. He had just bought a Boss 302 and considered it the greatest engineering achievement of mankind. I, on the other hand, am more of an all-around car guy. I see cars as objects, made by people, out of stuff dug from the ground, that are subject to the same laws of physics, regardless of the badge slapped on the front. Except for the GTR. The GTR says, "Fuck you, physics." The next episode will tell the story of Adam and I's white whale, our self-destructive battle to see who could slay the 8-minute barrier first. Thanks for watching.